Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mainstream Modular, a podcast brought to you by Guerdon Modular. I'm your host, Tyler Kern. Thank you so much for joining us here for another episode of the show. Today, we are taking a look at a study that's being performed, and it's going to explain a little bit more about why the Department of Energy is taking a look at modular construction and how it compares to site built. And so we're going to dive into this study a little bit more today with Jon Elliott. He's a professor at Colorado State University. Jon, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We are thrilled to have you on the show today, Jon. So, Jon, you are conducting a study right now, you and another professor. Tell us a little bit about that study, what you're looking at specifically, and a little bit more just about some of the interesting things that are going on in that study.
Yeah, sure. So this study is a collaboration between the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They're the principal investigator. Kevin Groskoff is a faculty member there who's leading the entire project. And then myself and one of my colleagues, John Killingsworth at Colorado State, are also a part of the research team. So the project itself is a Department of Energy project, specifically in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energies. And it's under the grant program, Advanced Building Construction with Energy Efficient Technology and Practice. And they just call it the ABC program. So it's a 3-year process. The funding was announced in the first quarter of 2020. And it's a 3-year project. So we've been collecting data for a couple of years and putting together the reports here coming up in the next year or so.
So I'm sure one of the follow-up questions that many people will have, and so this is why I'm going to ask it to you, is what interest does the Department of Energy have when it comes to researching modular construction? What are they looking to learn or understand from this study?
So the Department of Energy funds commercial building energy studies where they look at energy consumption. And in this advanced building construction grant or funding opportunity, they're looking at multifamily projects. They've done a site-built multifamily studies in the past, and now with the proliferation of modular volumetric modular construction, kind of want to understand a new concept. So looking at advanced technology and practice, that being the modular side of things, and then comparing that to traditional multifamily site built. And they just want to see, substantiate a lot of the things that we think about modular, higher quality insulation and things of that nature, double walls at mate walls and things like that, and see how it impacts the energy performance. So the study is 2 parts, and this kind of goes back to the first question, but the study is 2 parts, one for compliance and one for consumption. And so we're looking at 20 projects in compliance, so 10 modular and 10 site built, and then another 20 or so in the consumption side. So after occupancy, how they perform comparing modular to the site built, existing commercial studies they've already done. So that's kind of the idea of the study.
So give us some insight into the process then that you're going through to conduct this research and what that has looked like so far. Obviously, you mentioned that it kicked off in the early part of 2020. So I'm guessing there have been some complications along the way due to COVID. But tell us a little bit more about the process for doing the research.
Sure. Yeah. You're saying there's 2 parts, and they're separate studies, and then we triangulate the data from the consumption and compliance piece. So I'm more a part of the compliance portion of the study, so I'll talk about that one first. So we have 10 modular multifamily projects in 3 locations: Philadelphia, the state of California, and then the Seattle area. And those were selected, based on DOE feedback. The program manager wanted to select those locations, for the process. And so on the compliance study, we do a plan review, specification review as the first step. We visit the factory and confirm, the installation of the materials and everything we saw in the plan review portion. And then the final visit is on site near substantial completion. pre-occupancy, as close to that turnover of the building as possible to kind of reconfirm the information. And then we're comparing that to the building code that was used to construct that building itself. And then on the consumption side, it's looking at post-occupancy energy consumption. So based on actual data that's collected from the service providers and looking at how occupants are using the spaces and if there are differences between buildings that were built in a volumetric modular methodology versus just a traditional site built. So that's kind of the overarching study and kind of how we're processing through the data collection.
So you mentioned, some of the sites and some of the different locations, be it Philadelphia, state of California, and some others. How were those locations chosen specifically? What was the reasoning behind some of the locations that you chose?
Yeah, so initially when we put in our proposal for funding, we proposed ASHRAE climate zones. But then through the negotiation process, the program managers wanted to look at these three specific areas, Seattle and California, because they're fairly progressive on their energy standards. And then the state of California, because of Title 21, I believe. I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm just going to space on that. But their energy code is a lot more strict. And then Philadelphia, there's just a whole bunch of modular projects going on in Philadelphia based on some of the manufacturers out there. So East Coast, West Coast, a lot of multifamily going on in the traditional site built, methodology in Seattle and California, as well as Philly, but also good penetration in the market for, companies like Guerdon and others who are, supplying the modules. So that was kind of what we landed on after starting with ASHRAE climate zones, kind of moving through the process, what DOE wanted to see, and limiting it down to those three geographical regions. And it's Title 24 code, by the way. I just spaced that. So.
All good. So you mentioned that you're going to compare kind of usage rates post occupancy. Tell us a little bit about that process by which you're going to kind of compare that data and kind of look across these 10 projects. What is that comparison process going to look like, and what sorts of things are you looking for when you kind of compare the data from each of these locations?
So on the consumption side, that's what UNL is leading. So Kevin Groskopf is leading that portion. But what they're looking at is energy use intensity, based on square footage of these different areas. So common spaces, multifamily spaces. A lot of the mixed use projects that we have podiums. So we're trying to separate those out for apples to apples comparisons. Just to see if the energy consumption in lighting and things like that, however we can break it down based on the submetering, is different between modular and the traditional site built. The assumption there is that occupants and the way they use buildings, if we have enough sample, we're looking at it in aggregate. So all the site built compared to all the modular, to kind of normalize those different comparisons to see if modular is performing better than site built. So that's kind of the consumption side of it. On the compliance side, it's a lot of box checking, to be honest. I mean, code is what drives the building envelope in most cases and what's being used. And so far, we're building to that code in the manufacturing facility or on site, but the quality is where things kind of seem to be changing a little or differing a little bit between modular being done in a controlled environment versus the site built.
That's interesting. So have there been any findings that have surprised you, or I'm assuming that you always go into a study like this with some presuppositions, whether you want to or not. So how maybe has the study and what you've seen so far compared with maybe your assumptions going into this?
We try and go in with eyes wide open, non-biased as much as we can, and just make sure that our comparisons are as apples to apples as possible. We hear a lot about modular and some of the claims being made about energy efficiency and and disruption of the neighborhoods and workforce and all these different things. But this is obviously the energy side of it. I think the code really drives what's being put in place, because at the end of the day, it's cost, right? But to meet the same codes with higher levels of, higher quality installation, perhaps, that the mate walls and how things go together. So we haven't really been surprised yet. And we haven't looked at the full data because we're still in the process of collecting it. But it seems like the lighting side of things, modular might be a little bit better performance-wise. So it's just kind of interesting. So it is truly exploratory for us. It seems like the code drives most of it. And then I'll be really interested to see in the consumption side how it pans out, because I think that's where we'll really see the differences.
There are still some lingering, maybe negative stigmas around modular construction, and whether it's that the quality is poor, or things along those lines. Have you found that that those maybe stigmas that might still exist in certain corners of the industry, have you found any of them to be true or not true, or anything along those lines? Just curious about your thoughts on that.
I think the lack of understanding between manufactured and modular still kind of exists. I mean, although I think the owners that we get a chance to talk to, they've chosen volumetric modular or site built, so they know the advantages. I mean, the manufacturers have looked at those things. As far as quality of the interior, at substantial completion, you really can't tell. I can't tell. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And I've been in a lot of projects, a lot of buildings. You just walk around a multifamily project. I mean, there are certain things, if you really got down to it, like, bumped your head above the acoustical ceiling and said, oh, okay, all these connections were made, this is volumetric modular. But then, I would say 95% of the people in the world would never know that they're in a modular. And I think that's, that's something that I'd love to actually look at and survey, is people that live in these buildings, do they even know that they're in a modular building at all? I mean, that's the thing. So, I think some of those stigmas have been broken down. The quality in the factory is really high. And, we expected to see that. We took a lot of photo documentation, a lot of pictures and video of that kind of stuff. We did some air change stuff that is going to come out, and that's through Kevin Groskoff, but looking at actual blower door tests of different things, different points in the modular process, as well as on site. So there's some interesting real data that's going to be coming out here. But as far as the stigmas, I think it's going away. I mean, this is obviously just anecdotal on my part. But even when a project is, when all the modules are set and they're finishing the exterior side, I think most people walking by on the street have no idea that it's modular. So, yeah. So once the cranes leave, right? So
that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. And so it sounds like you're roughly about 2.5 years into the project, right? Right. Give us an idea of how far you are into this project now, and how much more work you have left.
So we are about 75% complete with data collection. And so next summer is kind of when the final deliverables are due, kind of a soft deadline on that. But, when it comes to, putting the reports together, we started to compile a lot of the data, but we're about 75% complete. I'm actually going out next week to look at a project in Pennsylvania in the factory that's going to be a Philadelphia project. So there's quite a bit left to do in the reporting side and analysis side, but we're getting there for sure. With COVID and material delays and other things, a lot of the projects got pushed back. Just with those, I have to change from one material to another based on supply, mid production. That caused a lot of issues. So we ended up pushing back a little bit on some of our dates. So, mid to late summer next year, we should be closing out.
When the project is closed out, is there a way for people to kind of access some of this research and to kind of tap into the insights that you've gleaned from this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So technically, I mean, it'll be published by the Department of Energy, the main report. But working with Department of Energy, we've been able to put together some conference papers and papers for journals that really talk more about the process in depth. And so, coming up in, I believe it's December or January. We have a conference paper in Florida with Kobe that'll come out, and just kind of talking about the process that we've done, moving through, preceding the actual reports. So they'll all come out publicly through DOE, and then some of the journal papers and conference papers will follow that once. We don't overstep the DOE report because that's the main brunt, but then we'll take portions of that and put it into more trade publications and things of that nature.
Excellent stuff. So, Jon, as we start to kind of wrap up this conversation and wind things down, what do you hope people maybe understand after listening to this conversation, or are there things that you want people to know just about the work that you're doing and maybe what you've seen about modular construction that maybe people wouldn't have known before checking out this podcast? Anything you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I think, as far as, multifamily construction, time to market for an owner is so important, and, getting these modules installed and shortening the overall duration of the project has so much benefit, not only for the owner financially, but just for the community. And also another area that I'm really interested in is the workforce development side. People coming to a fixed location to do the work in a controlled environment takes down a lot of the barriers that we're currently seeing in workforce issues in construction, where, it's hard to get from one project for 18 months to another for 6 months, then to another for 2 years. So, I mean, outside of the EUI energy stuff, I think there's a lot of benefits to this that really will change the way our industry moves forward, at least with multifamily, these repetitive type, once hospitality kind of comes back. And interestingly, I think one of the big surprises on our project was that we saw a lot of affordable housing, but also a lot of market rate. And I think that's another thing that's was kind of a surprise to me, kind of going back to one of your previous questions. If you're building a whole bunch of studios and say like a transitional housing for veterans or something like that, a lot of that stuff going on in California, but in Philly, a lot of it's market rate and, really high-end finishes and things of that nature. So I think some of that stuff, we're kind of changing the paradigm on what modular is and how much quality you're getting out of the final product. So that's been a real fun thing for me to see and learn about over the past couple of years.
That's really fascinating, and I can't wait to learn more about that and maybe even see more about that as the study kind of continues on and eventually reaches a close next summer. Jon Elliott, professor at Colorado State. Jon, thank you so much for joining us here on Mainstream Modular, talking a little bit more about the study that you're doing for the DOE and what you've seen and what you've experienced and learned so far from that study. It's been a pleasure.
I appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing. I hope that it gets some traction and people can start to learn some things that we're learning right alongside, trying to figure out this whole new paradigm in manufactured process in the modular industry, and volumetric modular in particular. So thank you very much, Tyler.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone out there that is tuning into this podcast, first of all, thank you so much for joining us here today, but also stay on the lookout for that study. We'll make sure to amplify it and make sure that people out there get the opportunity to check it out once it is published and that sort of thing. And who knows, maybe we'll have Jon back on in the future for a follow-up episode once the study is done. But stay tuned for that. But for this episode, everyone, thank you so much for joining us here for this episode of Mainstream Modular. As always, you can visit the Guerdon website to learn more about Guerdon and the work that they're doing in the modular construction world. And you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get podcasts these days. You can find Mainstream Modular there. So subscribe to stay up to date with the latest. But for this episode, for Jon Elliott, I'm Tyler Kern. We'll talk to you next time.